Some lies are born not to deceive anyone, but simply to keep someone alive until the next morning. And Della Hartley did not understand that until the night one of those lies saved her life. At 1 o'clock in the morning, a fine rain fell over the deserted parking lot behind a roadside diner on the outskirts of Pittsburgh, the neon sign reading open 24 hours flickering, as though it were about to die altogether, and Della pulled the collar of her thin coat tight around herself after 12 hours on her feet serving tables. She was 27 years old, her dark brown hair tied up in a hurried knot that had come loose, her calloused hands trembling from the cold, her wallet holding only a few scattered tip dollars, and a 9-year-old sister lying in the hospital, waiting for her to come back. She was used to finding a way through terrible nights, but tonight felt different. 2 men who had sat in the diner through her entire evening shift were now standing between her and her old car, not rushing, only moving toward her in silence. And every instinct inside Della screamed one thing: some lies are born not to deceive anyone, but simply to keep someone alive until the next morning. And Della Hartley did not understand that until the night one of those lies saved her life. At 1 o'clock in the morning, a fine rain fell over the deserted parking lot behind a roadside diner on the outskirts of Pittsburgh, the neon sign reading open 24 hours flickering, as though it were about to die altogether, and Della pulled the collar of her thin coat tight around herself after 12 hours on her feet serving tables. She was 27 years old, her dark brown hair tied up in a hurried knot that had come loose, her calloused hands trembling from the cold, her wallet holding only a few scattered tip dollars, and a 9-year-old sister lying in the hospital, waiting for her to come back. She was used to finding a way through terrible nights, but tonight felt different. 2 men who had sat in the diner through her entire evening shift were now standing between her and her old car, not rushing, only moving toward her in silence. And every instinct inside Della screamed one thing: run. But there was nowhere left to run. The road ahead was pitch dark, the diner had closed behind her, and the parking lot stretched wide beneath the sickly yellow lights. Then she saw him, a man standing alone beneath the awning beside a sleek black car, his dark tailored suit fitting broad shoulders, his black hair already marked with a few early strands of silver, his eyes gray as cold steel staring straight into the rain without even bothering to blink. He looked out of place beside that rundown diner, and yet at the same time, he seemed to own it completely, with the bearing of a man who did not need to prove anything to anyone. And Della noticed something else too. Even the toughest cook in the diner avoided that man's gaze. One of the 2 men behind her began to move closer, slow and deliberate, and her heart pounded until she could hardly breathe. She had no other choice. Before fear could steal the last scrap of courage she had left, Della crossed the parking lot, her shoes splashing through the water, her breath quick and uneven, then reached out and clutched the stranger's sleeve. "Honey," she blurted, her voice breaking loudly enough for the 2 men to hear. "I'm sorry I'm late. My car's been dead forever." The whole parking lot suddenly went still. Della regretted it at once, certain he would jerk his arm away, ask if she had lost her mind, and leave her standing there. But the man only lowered his eyes to the hand gripping his sleeve, his expression unchanged, then placed one hand on her shoulder, warm and steady, and answered as smoothly as if they had rehearsed this scene 100 times. "I've been waiting for you," he said softly, and the 2 men stopped. Della almost forgot how to breathe. Then those gray eyes moved past her shoulder and settled on the 2 figures in the rain, and in a voice so low it chilled her to the bone, he added one sentence that sent cold running down her spine. "And now I know exactly who's been following you. If this opening pulled you in, please press like to support the channel. Don't forget to share this story with the people you love. And subscribe to the channel now so you won't miss the next episodes." The 2 men stood there for one more beat, long enough for Della to feel the calculation in their eyes, then slowly backed away, dissolving into the rain like 2 trails of fading smoke. The stranger did not release her shoulder at once. He only tipped his head slightly toward the black car, a gesture so small she would not have noticed it if she had not been standing so close beside him, then said in a low, even voice, the kind of voice that made people obey before they had time to ask why, "Get in the car." Della hesitated. Everything her mother had ever taught her, everything 12 hours of serving strangers on her feet had ever taught her, told her not to climb into a car with a man she did not know in the middle of the night. But behind her was the darkness where those two men had just disappeared, and her old car was sitting alone in the lot, and perhaps they were already waiting for her there. She swallowed hard, then opened the car door and sat down on the soft leather seat that still carried the scent of newness. The door closed with a solid thud, and suddenly the rain, the wind, and the weary city outside were all cut off, leaving only the thick silence inside the car. The man slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and the car glided smoothly out of the lot. Della glanced at him from the corner of her eye. In the streetlights streaking across the windshield, his face appeared and sank back into shadow, steady as breathing. He did not bother looking at her, his eyes fixed on the wet road, both hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, so relaxed that it unsettled her. A person was supposed to be tense after helping a stranger escape two suspicious men, but he was not. He was calm, as if this were only another ordinary night in his life. "Thank you," she finally said, her voice still trembling. "I didn't know what else to do." He did not answer right away. Only after the car turned onto a broader street where the city lights began to multiply did he speak. "Do you know who those two men were?" Della shook her head. "No, I've never seen them before. They sat in the diner all evening, ordered coffee, and never drank it." He gave a very slight nod, as though her answer had confirmed something he had already known. "They didn't come to the diner for coffee." The sentence dropped between them like a stone thrown into still water. Della turned sharply to look at him. "What do you mean, do you know them?" He did not answer that question. Instead, his eyes flicked briefly to the rearview mirror, once then returned to the road. Something in that gesture made her heart tighten. She turned her head to look behind them, and there, several cars back, through the rain now falling heavier, a gray pickup truck was quietly following, its cloudy headlights like two unblinking eyes. "Don't turn around again," he said quietly, his voice still calm but with something colder beneath it. "Just sit still." Della faced forward again, her hands clenched together in her lap. Her heart pounded so hard she thought he might hear it. "That truck," she whispered. "It's following us." "I know." He changed lanes, not hurriedly, not in panic, simply shifting direction like any ordinary driver. Yet the pickup behind them changed lanes too. Della felt her throat go dry. All her life, she had been used to fears she could name. Fear of not having enough money for hospital bills, fear of the landlord knocking at the door, fear of having her shifts cut. But the fear tonight was different. It had no shape, no reason, and that was what made it more frightening than all the rest. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice so small it was almost swallowed by the engine. "You don't even know who I am." The man was silent for a long while. The red light ahead cast a dim glow over his face, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw something difficult to read pass across the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, not quite anything else. "I don't like seeing people hunted," he replied. It was not a complete answer, and both of them knew it. The light turned green. The car rolled forward again. A moment later, still without taking his eyes from the road, he asked, his voice suddenly lighter, almost casual. "What's your name?" Della hesitated. In that instant, speaking her own name suddenly felt important, almost dangerous, though she did not understand why. But this man had just saved her, and she had very little left to lose. "Della," she said. "Della Hartley." In the moment that surname left her lips, something changed on his face. It was very slight, very quick, only a tightening along the line of his jaw, a flash of something that appeared and vanished in his gray eyes. But Della saw it, and she suddenly understood that her father's name, the surname she had carried all her life, meant something to this stranger, something she could not yet begin to guess. He did not explain why that name had made him stop, and Della had no chance to press him, because the car suddenly turned onto a narrow road along the river, where the lights were sparser, and the gray pickup behind them had to slow down to keep its distance. She used that brief silence to study the man more closely, trying to piece scattered fragments together into a picture that made sense. He was not like any customer who had ever sat in the diner where she worked. The watch on his wrist, his leather shoes, even the way he held the steering wheel all gave off a kind of quiet power, the kind of power that did not need to display itself for people to feel it. She remembered the look in the eyes of the cook at the diner, a man who usually feared neither heaven nor earth. Yet the moment this man had walked in, he had lowered his face toward the stove and had not dared look up. She remembered the way those two suspicious men had faltered, not because of her, but because of him, and she began to understand that she had just taken hold of the sleeve of a man the whole city probably knew better than to go near. "Who are you?" she asked, and this time her voice trembled less and carried more resolve. A decent man wouldn't make those two so afraid. He glanced at her for a moment, and for the first time in those gray eyes there flickered something almost like amusement, but it vanished so quickly that she wondered whether she had imagined it. "Soren," he said. "Soren Vale." The name meant nothing to Della, but the way he said it, calmly, without adding a word of explanation, made her feel that it should mean something, that there were people in this city who needed only to hear those two words to understand how they ought to behave. "Is that name supposed to make me feel safe or afraid?" she asked. The corner of his mouth moved faintly again. "That depends on who you are." Della fell silent. She was not a fool. She had lived long enough in the shadowed corners of the city to know that there were powers moving beneath the surface of ordinary life, people who controlled the docks, the warehouses, the vehicles that came and went in the night without anyone asking questions or filing reports. People whispered about them in late-night bars, calling them by names that were never spoken aloud. And now, sitting beside this man, feeling the stillness that radiated from him like cold from a block of ice, she knew she was sitting beside one of them. She should have been terrified, but strangely, even though every instinct told her this man was dangerous, not once did she feel that danger aimed at her. He was cold, guarded, the kind of man who made others move aside, but with her, he had never raised his voice, had never threatened her, had even told her to sit still, as though he were protecting something fragile. "You control the eastern docks, don't you?" she blurted, and instantly regretted her recklessness. Soren did not answer, but he did not deny it either, and that silence was the clearest answer of all. "You should ask fewer questions," he said at last, his voice still light, but carrying a line she understood she should not cross. "There are things that won't help you once you know them. They'll only bring you more trouble." "I think I've already had more than enough trouble tonight," she replied, and this time she was the one surprised by her own boldness. Soren said nothing, but she saw his jaw loosen a little, as though her answer pleased him in some way. The car rolled across a low bridge over the black water, and in the distance, the lights of the dock cranes rose against the rainy sky, silent and enormous like sleeping beasts. Della looked at them and suddenly realized that an entire vast world, the world she knew only through rumors, might lie within reach of the man sitting beside her. She tightened her grip on the strap of her bag, trying to hold back the feeling that she was drifting farther and farther away from the life she knew, the life made up only of shifts, scattered tips, and the little sister waiting for her at home. Then Soren's phone vibrated inside his coat pocket. He took it out with one hand, his eyes still on the road, and glanced quickly at the screen. And Della, though she did not mean to, still caught sight of what appeared there. Not a line of text, not a call, a photograph. And in the moment the screen's light cast itself over his face, she saw that calm, the calm that had not cracked once through the whole drive, soften for the first time. Soren said nothing, but he pulled the car slowly to the curb beneath the darkness of a row of old warehouses along the road, then turned the phone screen toward her. Della leaned down to look, and for a moment she did not understand what she was seeing. It was a photograph taken in daylight, slightly blurred, angled as though it had been taken secretly from a distance. In the picture was Della herself, wearing her familiar waitress uniform, standing at the diner's back door, handing a hot container of food to an elderly man huddled beside the trash bins. She recognized that moment at once. It was Mr. Marlowe, the old dishwasher who sometimes came by the diner to work odd hourly shifts, the man for whom she quietly saved leftovers whenever the night shift ended, because she knew he had no one and nowhere to go. The photograph had been taken 6 months ago. She remembered because it had been raining that day too, just like tonight. "Why do you have this picture?" she asked, her voice catching. "Who took it?" Soren drew the phone back, his face returning to its usual calm, though there was something heavier in his eyes. "I didn't take it," he said. "Someone just sent it to me. And what matters isn't the photograph. It's that it was taken 6 months ago." Della felt a coldness run down her spine. 6 months. For 6 months, someone had been standing somewhere in the dark, watching her, recording her smallest gestures. That moment she had thought no one had noticed. That quiet act of kindness she had done, only because her heart would not allow her to do otherwise. "I don't understand," she whispered, her hands beginning to tremble. "I'm just a waitress." I have nothing. I owe money. I live in a leaky rented apartment. I can't even afford to fix my car. Why would anyone follow me for 6 months? Soren looked at her for a long while, and she had the feeling he was weighing how much to tell her, like a man measuring the weight of the truth before placing it on someone else's shoulders. That is exactly what I'm trying to find out, he said at last. Men who spend half a year watching someone don't do it because that person is poor. They do it because that person knows something, or has something, that they badly want. But I don't know anything, she answered, almost pleading. I swear I don't know anything at all. And the instant she said those words, another thought pierced through her mind like an icy needle, giving all that shapeless fear a sudden, specific, painful form. If they had been watching her for the past 6 months, then they also knew about Sophie. They knew she had a 9-year-old little sister lying in the hospital. They knew that every evening after work she stopped there, sat beside her sister's bed, and told her silly little stories to help her forget the smell of antiseptic. Her hands shook hard, and she hurriedly dug through her bag for her old phone, nearly dropping it onto the car floor. My sister, she stammered. I have to call my sister. Soren did not stop her. He only watched silently as she dialed with trembling fingers, and in that silence there was something almost like gentleness, though she did not notice it. The phone rang once, then twice, and every passing second stretched as long as a century. Then an older woman's voice came through on the other end. Mrs. Coleman, the kind neighbor who watched Sophie for her whenever Della worked the night shift and stopped by the hospital. Della, it's late, child. Is something wrong? Della closed her eyes, tears spilling into their corners with relief. No, nothing's wrong, Mom. I just wanted to check on Sophie. Is she all right? She's fine, child. I just got back from the hospital. She was sleeping soundly, and she even told me to remind you to bring that comic book she likes tomorrow. Della let out a small laugh, half like crying. Yes, I'll bring it. Thank you, Mom. Please lock your door carefully. She hung up and held the phone against her chest for a moment, letting her heartbeat slow. Sophie was still safe, still sleeping peacefully in a warm hospital room, knowing nothing about the storm closing around her older sister. The thought both eased Della's heart and filled her with more resolve than ever, that whatever happened tonight, she had to keep that storm far away from her sister. Soren waited until she had calmed before starting the car again. But instead of turning back toward her boarding house, he steered onto another road, toward the tall, brightly lit buildings downtown. Wait, Della said, bewildered. My place isn't this way. Soren looked straight ahead, his voice quiet but so final that it allowed no argument. You can't go home tonight. Della was about to protest, but when she glanced at the rearview mirror and saw the dim headlights of the gray pickup still stubbornly following through the rain, every word died in her throat. She understood that going home now would mean leading the storm straight to the place where she lived. And if they had been watching her for 6 months, they knew perfectly well where that was. She rested her head against the cold window, watched the raindrops slide down in long streaks, and for the first time in her life, she surrendered her fate to a complete stranger. The car slipped through several empty streets, changed direction a few times with clear purpose, and by the time Della looked back again, the pickup was no longer in sight. Soren said nothing, but she saw his shoulders ease slightly, and she understood that he had just shaken off whoever had been following them. At last, the car turned into the parking garage of a high-rise standing quietly at the edge of downtown, where an automatic barrier lifted the moment it recognized his car, without a single word exchanged. They took the elevator up very high, so high Della's ears began to ring, and when the elevator doors slid open, she stepped into a vast apartment submerged in a soft, warm glow. Dark, polished wood floors, bookshelves rising all the way to the ceiling, an enormous glass window looking out over the whole city, glittering below like a sea of fallen stars. The place was so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat. Strangely, though the apartment was unfamiliar and overwhelmingly elegant, it did not make her feel trapped. Instead, the moment the door closed, a strange sense of safety wrapped around her, as if the chaotic city outside could no longer reach her. You can sit down, Soren said, taking off his rain-wet coat and draping it over the back of a chair. No one will find you here. Della sat on the edge of a wide armchair, her hands still clasped together in her lap, and without meaning to, she thought of Sophie again. She took out her phone, hesitated for a moment, then called Mrs. Coleman once more, even though she knew it was far too late. The older woman answered in a sleepy but caring voice. Della, what is it, child? Is something wrong? No, Mom, nothing's wrong, Della said, trying to keep her voice as steady as she could. I just wanted to say something unexpected came up tonight, so I can't come home. Could you please keep an eye on my place for me tonight? And Mom, tomorrow, if you stop by the hospital to see Sophie, please just tell her I had to pick up an extra shift. Don't let her worry. Mrs. Coleman gave a soft little laugh. Don't you fret. She's much better now, and I'll take good care of everything. Wherever you're going, you take care of yourself, you hear me? Della felt her throat tighten at that simple kindness. Yes. Thank you so much, ma'am. She hung up, and for a moment she only sat there, holding the phone tightly, letting the warmth of her sister's life, carried to her through Mrs. Coleman's words, fill the frightened emptiness in her chest. Soren stood beside the large glass window, silently looking out over the city, giving her that bit of privacy without intruding. When she finally looked up, he turned back, and in his gray eyes there was no longer the cold scrutiny he had worn in the car, but something calmer, almost like understanding. You have a little sister, he said, not as a question. 9 years old. She's in the hospital. Della did not ask how he knew, because too many things tonight had already been known to him in ways she could not explain. She's all I have, she answered softly. Whatever is happening, I just need her to be safe. That's all. Soren looked at her for a long time, then gave one very slight nod, like a silent promise he did not put into words. She'll be safe, he said. Before Della could answer, footsteps sounded from the inner hallway, steady and slow. She turned her head, and from the shadows of the passage, an older woman stepped out, slender but standing perfectly straight, her silver hair neatly pinned, her eyes sharp and warm at the same time, the eyes of someone who had seen far too much in life. She stopped at the threshold of the room, looked Della over from head to toe, and across her face passed an expression difficult to name. Something like astonishment and a long-buried emotion all at once. Then she spoke, her voice trembling but clear, calling her by the very name Della had not told anyone inside this apartment. Della. At last, you are here. Della sprang to her feet, her heart stumbling wildly, her eyes moving from the older woman to Soren and then back to her again, trying to find an explanation in these unfamiliar faces. How do you know my name? She asked, her voice breaking with confusion. I've never met you. I've never set foot in this place. The woman stepped a few paces farther into the room, resting one hand on the back of a chair as if to steady herself, and her eyes never left Della's face, studying every line, as though comparing it to a memory that had slept too long. I am Theodora, she said softly. I have looked after this house, and this family, for longer than all the years of your life put together. As for how I know your name, that is a story much longer than what you're ready to hear tonight. Della turned to Soren, but he only gave a slight nod toward the old woman, as if returning to her the right to decide what should be said. Enough, Della said, and she was startled by the firmness in her own voice. All night, everyone has been telling me half a sentence and then stopping. Someone has been watching me for 6 months. 2 men cornered me in a parking lot, and now a woman I've never met knows my name. I deserve to know what is happening. Theodora looked at her for a long time, and instead of irritation, something almost like satisfaction appeared on her face, as though that very courage had confirmed something she had suspected for a very long while. You are more like him than you know, she murmured, almost only to herself. Like who? Della pressed at once, but Theodora did not answer that. She slowly walked to a low wooden cabinet against the wall, opened a drawer, and took out an object she held carefully in both hands, as if it were more fragile than anything else in that expensive room. It was a small notebook, its leather cover worn with age, the corners rubbed thin by years and by the hands that had turned its pages. She placed it on the table, but kept her hand resting over it, not yet opening it. This notebook belonged to Soren's father, she said. He died many years ago. But before he left this world, he left behind an instruction, a promise this family has kept for all these years, even when none of us fully understood what it meant. Della held her breath. What promise? Theodora lifted her eyes to her, and in those old eyes there was a light both compassionate and heavy. That if one day someone bearing the Hartley name came to this door, the Vale family was to protect that person at any cost, without asking why. The whole room seemed to sink under the weight of it. Della felt her legs threaten to give way, and she had to grip the arm of the chair to stay standing. Hartley, she repeated, almost in a whisper. That was my father's name. But my father left when I was very little. I can't even remember his face. How could Soren's father have known mine? Theodora shook her head faintly, and her hand tightened slightly over the notebook. There are questions whose answers do not belong to me, child, she said, using gentler form of address for the first time. I kept the promise. I did not create it. Most of what Soren's father knew he took with him to the grave. The rest lies in places you must find for yourself. Then this notebook. Della reached toward it. What does it say? But Theodora gently drew the notebook closer to herself, hesitation passing through her eyes. Not yet, she said softly. There are truths that, if spoken at the wrong time, wound more than they heal. You have endured enough tonight. Rest first. Della wanted to protest, wanted to snatch up the notebook and read every page, but the exhaustion of 12 hours on her feet serving tables, combined with the shock of an entire long night, suddenly collapsed onto her shoulders all at once, leaving her without the strength to argue. Theodora returned the notebook to the drawer, then quietly left the room, leaving more questions behind her than answers. Soren also said he would let her rest and showed her the guest room at the end of the hallway. But as Della passed the long table by the glass window, her eyes accidentally swept over a thick folder lying there, a file someone had left behind, and she froze. Because on the cover of that folder, written clearly in black ink, was her own name, Della Hartley. Every trace of weariness in Della vanished in an instant, replaced by a freezing chill that ran down her spine. She stepped toward the table as though hypnotized, her trembling hand touching the cover of the file, almost hoping she had seen it wrong. But the name was still there, black and clear against the yellowed paper, impossible to deny. She opened the first page, and the world beneath her feet seemed to tilt. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, all of her, taken from a distance, from angles and moments she had never known about. She was walking out of the diner beneath the neon lights. She was waiting for the bus on a cold street corner. She was locking the door of her shabby, leaking apartment each morning. There was even a picture of her stepping through the hospital gates where Sophie was being treated, her arms wrapped tightly around a paper bag of food. And seeing that image made her heart twist, because it meant they knew about her sister, that they had stood there, right outside the place that should have been Sophie's safest refuge. Beside each photograph were short, cold notes listing the date, the time, the location, and her habits. Her work schedule was recorded meticulously, down to every shift. The route she took each day had been carefully mapped. Even the visiting hours at the hospital had been noted in full. The oldest entries went back 6 months. For 6 months, someone had turned her small, quiet life into a file to be dissected, recorded, arranged, as though she were an animal behind glass instead of a human being. What is this? She spun around, her voice almost rising into a shout, her eyes blurring with anger and fear tangled together. Soren stood a few steps away, and when his gaze fell on the file in her hands, his expression changed in a way she had not seen all night. His familiar calm cracked for one moment, giving way to something almost like real shock. He strode toward her, took the file from her hands, turned through page after page, and Della saw his jaw grow tighter with each one. "I've never seen this before," he said, his voice low and tense. "In your own home," she snapped back, tears spilling down her face. "A file tracking me for 6 months is lying right here on your table, and you want me to believe you've never seen it. That answer would be a lot more convincing if your name weren't the kind that makes this whole city lower its head." Soren looked up at her, and in those gray eyes there was no anger at her accusation, only a chilling seriousness. "I understand why you don't believe me," he said slowly. "If I were you, I wouldn't believe me either. But Della, listen to me carefully. This file was not made by me. I have not been watching you. I only learned you existed a few hours ago, the moment you ran up and grabbed my sleeve in that parking lot." "Then where did it come from?" she asked, her voice choking. "Why is it here?" Soren did not answer right away. He kept turning the pages one after another, his face growing darker and darker, until his hand stopped on the final page. Della followed his gaze, and her breath seemed to freeze inside her chest. The last page was not a photograph of her going to work, nor one of her coming home. It was the same picture Soren had shown her in the car earlier, the one of her standing at the diner's back door, handing the hot container of food to Mr. Marlowe on a rainy night 6 months ago. But this time, beneath the photograph, there was another line she had not seen in the car, a line written in dark red ink, neat and cold as a sentence passed down by a judge. Della read it, and it felt as if the ground beneath her had disappeared. The line said, Subject has made contact with the remaining witness. She lifted her eyes to Soren, her lips parting without sound, and in the thick silence of the room, only one question echoed through her mind, a question that turned her whole body cold. Witness. Mr. Marlowe, the elderly, gentle dishwasher, the man she had only pitied and shared a little leftover food with. What in the world had he witnessed? Soren closed the file, but that dark red line seemed to keep burning in the air between them. He stood silent for a moment, his gaze fixed thoughtfully on empty space, and Della could see the gears turning in his mind, fitting together pieces she herself could not yet see. Then he turned and called toward the hallway, his voice low but urgent. Theodora. The older woman returned almost at once, as if she had never gone far, and when her eyes touched the file in Soren's hand, her face went faintly pale. "Have you seen this before?" he asked. Theodora stepped forward, took the file, and her hand trembled slightly as she looked at the name on the cover. "Someone brought it here," she said slowly, her voice heavy. "A few days ago. An older man, thin, wearing an old knit cap, came to the front of the building before dawn. He refused to give his name, only kept insisting that he had to see a member of the Vale family. He said there was something that had to be delivered by hand, that it was a matter of life and death, that this family would understand once we saw it. I took the packet and promised I would give it to Soren, but that night you were away, then everything kept rushing forward, and I..." Her voice sank, filled with regret. "I placed it on the table, meaning to show it to you the moment you came home. I never opened it. I did not know what was inside." Soren looked at her, then at Della, and a truth began to take shape in his eyes. "That man," he said, one word at a time. "Can you describe him? Did he say anything else?" Theodora frowned, trying to search her memory. He was thin, weather-darkened, with hands calloused like a man who had labored all his life. And before he left, he said one strange thing that I have not forgotten. He said if he did not come back, then this family had to find the girl with the Hartley name, because she was the last person left whom he had not managed to protect. Della felt her breath catch. She stepped closer, her heart pounding fast. Was he? Was his name Marlowe? An old dishwasher, often wearing a gray knit cap, with the fingers of his right hand bent from being broken once. Theodora looked up sharply, confirmation flashing in her eyes. Yes, he did mention that name. Marlowe. The room seemed to hold its breath. Della staggered back and leaned against the chair, her mind spinning. Mr. Marlowe. The gentle old man for whom she had saved food, the man she had thought was only a lonely, homeless soul with nowhere to go, had somehow made his way to the very door of the most powerful family in the city, carrying a file about her, and left behind a warning before disappearing. That file had not been created by the enemy to hunt her. It was something Marlowe had somehow taken from the hands of the people watching her, then risked his life to bring here, like a silent cry for help, like a way of telling the Vale family to protect this girl. They are coming for her. He was trying to warn me, Della whispered, tears rising in her eyes. All this time he knew. He knew someone was watching me, and he tried to protect me in the only way he could. She lifted her eyes to Soren, her voice breaking. I have to find him. I have to talk to him. He's the only person who knows what is really happening. Soren had already taken out his phone, his fingers moving quickly over the screen, calling someone in short, commanding phrases. He spoke only a few sentences, listened for several seconds, then ended the call. But when he looked up, his face had changed, and that change made Della's heart sink. My people just checked, he said, his voice low and slow. The diner where you work. The rented room Mr. Marlowe sometimes took by the week. Even the usual places a man like him might go. He paused for one beat, and Della knew, even before he said it, that what came next would not be good. No one has been able to reach him for nearly a week. Marlowe has disappeared. The news weighed over the room like a black curtain, and Della dropped into the chair, covering her face with both hands. Mr. Marlowe had disappeared. The only person who might be able to give her answers, the person who had risked himself to warn her, had now dissolved into the darkness just like the very man hunting her. Theodora quietly poured her a cup of hot tea and placed it in her hands without a word, letting the warmth of the cup speak comfort in her place. Soren stood by the window, his eyes fixed on the rain-drowned city, his shoulders tense beneath his shirt, and for the first time Della realized that even this powerful man was facing something beyond his control. Time passed in silence. The clock on the wall marked nearly 2 o'clock in the morning, and exhaustion finally began to drag Della's eyelids down, though fear still churned inside her chest. Then her old phone vibrated on the table, a dry, harsh buzz that tore through the stillness and made all three people in the room turn sharply. Della looked down at the screen, her brow furrowing. "Unknown number," she said softly. "Who would be texting me at this hour?" Soren crossed the room quickly and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Don't open it yet," he said, his voice wary. "Let me look first." But the phone vibrated again, then again, 3 messages arriving one after another from the same nameless number. Della drew in a deep breath and opened them. The first message was only a single address, a street deep in the old Eastern Dock District, a place she knew was full of abandoned warehouses where few people went. The second message was a string of numbers, a date from 19 years ago, and the third message, made up of only 4 words, turned her whole body cold. "Ask about your father." Della read those 4 words again and again, and something old and painful, something she had thought buried deep inside her long ago, suddenly came back to life. Her father, that faint shadow whose face she could barely remember anymore. The man who had left her mother and her when she was too young to understand, leaving behind a mother worn thin by work, and a daughter who grew up with an emptiness in her heart that never healed. "My father left when I was only 5, she said, her voice small and trembling, speaking almost more to herself than to the 2 others. "My mother told me he went away for work and never came back. I grew up thinking he didn't need us, that he chose to leave. For all these years, every time someone mentioned the word father, all I felt was anger and shame. I don't even know whether he's alive or dead." She lifted her eyes to Soren, tears shimmering in them. "Why would someone, at 2 o'clock in the morning, tell me to ask about a father who abandoned me more than 20 years ago?" Soren did not answer, because he had no answer either. But she saw his eyes darken, and she knew that in his mind, the Hartley name that had made him go still when he heard it in the car. His father's old promise, and now this message, were all beginning to join into a thread she could not yet see. Before anyone could say another word, the phone vibrated one last time. This time it was not text, it was a photograph. Della opened it with trembling fingers, and when the image became clear on the screen, she forgot to breathe. It was an old photograph, its colors yellowed with age, its edges worn thin. In the picture, 2 men stood beside each other on a pier, the shapes of ships blurred behind them in the morning mist. One of the men, the one on the left, was young and thin, with a gentle smile and eyes she recognized at once, though more than 20 years had passed, though all that remained in her memory was the hazy recollection of a 5-year-old child, the eyes she still saw every morning when she looked in the mirror, her own eyes. It was her father, and the man standing beside him, tall and stern, with a chillingly familiar air of authority, was someone Della had never met, but by some vague instinct, she felt she should have known who he was. Della turned the phone screen towards Soren, her hand trembling so badly she nearly dropped it. "The man standing beside my father," she asked, her voice catching. "Do you know who he is?" Soren took the phone, and the instant his eyes touched the photograph, she saw his whole body go rigid. He stared at the tall, stern man for a very long time, so long that Della thought he might never answer. Then he spoke, his voice unusually hoarse. "That is my father." Those 3 words fell into the room like silent thunder. Della went still, her eyes moving from Soren to Theodora, who had stepped closer, and when the old woman bent to look at the photograph on the screen, her hands trembled, and a tear slipped from the corner of her wrinkled eye. "The 2 of them," she whispered. "I have not seen this photograph in nearly 20 years. Soren strode to the low wooden cabinet where Theodora had put away the notebook earlier, pulled open the drawer, and took it out. This time he did not hesitate. He turned through the yellowed pages, his finger moving over the slanted handwriting of his father, until he stopped on a page near the end and his breath caught. Della stepped closer and looked over his shoulder. Among the dense lines of notes, one name had been underlined, written clearly in ink faded by the years. "Eamon Hartley. That is my father's name," Della whispered, and tears began to fall before she even realized it. Eamon Hartley. I still remember that name. It was the only name my mother would never speak. Soren scanned the lines around that name, his face growing darker and darker, and when he lifted his eyes to her, there was something in their gray depths she had never seen before, a deep compassion. "Della," he said slowly, as if weighing every word so it would not make her collapse, "your father did not abandon you. Your father did not leave because he wanted to." She shook her head, not understanding, not daring to understand. "What do you mean?" Soren set the notebook down on the table. opened to the page that held her father's name, and began to tell her, piece by piece, what he had read and what he could put together from the blurred fragments of his own memory. Many years ago, Della's father, Eamon Hartley, had been an ordinary man with one thing very few people dared to have: integrity. He had once worked for a large organization, a place wrapped in the glossy appearance of charity, and during his work there, he had accidentally uncovered a terrible truth: that behind all those beautiful fundraising efforts was an entire network of embezzlement, a flow of dirty money being washed through false relief funds, stealing bread from thousands of desperate people. Eamon had not stayed silent. He had decided to stand as a witness and expose everything, though he knew doing so would place himself and his family in the sights of the most powerful and ruthless people. And when those people began hunting your father, Soren continued, his voice lowering, my father was the one who helped. My father helped Eamon disappear, took him somewhere safe, cut off every connection, even with his wife and child. That is why your father had to leave you and your mother, Della. Not because he did not love you both, but because he knew that as long as he stayed beside you, the two of you would always be in danger. He left so you could live. Della sank into the nearest chair, her whole body trembling, and the tears she had held back for more than 20 years finally broke loose. All her life, she had resented the father she believed had cast her aside. All her life, she had grown up with the wound of believing she had not mattered enough for him to stay. Yet the truth was the opposite. He had loved her enough to accept being separated from her, to carry the name of an unfaithful man in exchange for her safety. My father is the reason this family promised to protect me, she whispered through her tears, looking up at Theodora. Soren's father's promise. That is why, isn't it? Because my father risked his own life to protect the truth, Soren's father promised to protect me. Theodora nodded, unable to hold back her tears, and placed her aged hand on Della's shoulder. Soren bent over the notebook once more, and when his eyes stopped on the final line, written hurriedly near the edge of the page, his face darkened. It was a postscript, the handwriting shakier, as though it had been written in haste and fear. He read it aloud, one word at a time, and every word was like a cold blade. If Marlowe Quinn ever comes to you one day, it means they have found her father. The name Marlowe Quinn sounded in the room and lingered among them like the final piece of a puzzle falling into place. Della looked up sharply, wiping away her tears. Quinn, she repeated. His last name is Quinn. For 6 months, I've been calling him Mr. Marlowe without ever knowing his surname. My father wrote his name in this notebook more than 20 years ago, like a warning. Soren closed the notebook, and this time when he spoke, his voice carried the certainty of a man who had just assembled the whole picture. Marlowe Quinn was not some homeless man who happened to drift into the diner where you work, he said. He came there because of you, Della, because you are Eamon Hartley's daughter. He paused, paced a few steps around the room, then turned back to face her. I need to tell you the truth about something. My being in that diner parking lot tonight was not an accident. Della looked at him, her breath catching. What do you mean? Soren sat down in the chair across from her, braced his elbows on his knees, and for the first time narrowed the distance between them. My men have been watching Marlowe Quinn for several weeks, he said. Not to hurt him, but because I received word that an old name was surfacing again, a name tied to my family from the time my father was still alive. I did not know the whole story. I only knew that something from the past was stirring, and Marlowe was the only thread I could follow. I went to that diner tonight because it was one of the places he often visited. I went there looking for him. Instead, I found you. Della sat still, each of his words opening another layer of truth. So from the very beginning, their meeting had not been some vague arrangement of fate, but 2 threads from the same old tapestry, accidentally drawn together on a rainy night. But why now, she asked, and it was the question that had haunted her all night. If my father disappeared more than 20 years ago, if everything sank into silence for all that time, then why suddenly tonight this week are people watching me, hunting me, making Marlowe disappear? Why now? Theodora, who had been standing quietly beside them, finally spoke, her voice low and sad, because perhaps Mr. Marlowe knew he did not have much time left. Both Della and Soren turned to look at her. Theodora sat down and folded her hands together. The man who came knocking at this door, she said. He looked very weak. His skin was gray, he kept coughing, and there was something in his eyes, the look of a man who knows his time is running out. I think he was ill, gravely ill. Soren nodded slowly. as though that piece had just fitted into what his own people had gathered. "That explains everything," he said. "A man kept a secret for 20 years, stayed silent so he could live in peace. But when he realized he was running out of time, he did not want to take the truth to his grave. He decided to act. He stood and walked to the window. My people traced one lead. Not long ago, Marlowe Quinn secretly contacted a journalist and sent part of the old documents he had kept hidden all these years. He was trying to bring the truth into the light, one last time, before it was too late." Della felt a chill run down her spine as she began to understand. "And the people behind it," she whispered, "they found out what he was doing." "Yes," Soren said, his voice heavy. "For 20 years they believed everything had been buried forever. Then suddenly, old files started moving. A journalist started asking questions, and a name they thought was dead came back to life. They panicked. They had to seal every opening before the truth broke loose. That is why they are hunting Marlowe. And that is why they came for you, Della, because you are the daughter of the witness from all those years ago, because they are afraid he gave something to you, or that you know something you do not even know you know." She stood, her hands clenched tight, her heart pounding now not from fear, but from a determination that had begun to burn. "Then we have to find him," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Marlowe is sick, hiding, being hunted, and he is the only person who holds the whole truth. If they find him before we do." She did not finish the sentence because she did not have to. Soren had already turned to look at her, and in his eyes was the same urgency. "Then we lose him forever," he said. "We have to find Marlowe before it's too late." For all the remaining hours of the night, Soren mobilized his entire network. Quiet people spread across the city, following every faint trace Marlowe Quinn had left behind. By the time dawn began to break along the horizon, tinting the clouds after the rain a gentle silver gray, one of his men called with a lead. Someone had seen a thin old man in a knit cap lingering near a small chapel in the countryside about an hour's drive from the city, where an elderly priest still quietly took in lost souls with nowhere else to go. Della did not hesitate for even a second. They left as soon as morning came. The road out of the city grew emptier mile by mile, the high-rises giving way to damp fields and bare rows of trees soaked in mist. The chapel appeared at the end of a dirt road, small and old, with moss covering its stone walls and a weather-faded wooden cross on the roof. The scene was so peaceful, it was almost impossible to believe that hidden in this place was a man carrying on his shoulders the truth of more than 20 years. Inside, the air held the faint scent of candles and old wood, morning light passing through the stained glass and spilling gentle colors across the floor. And there, on the last pew near the altar, a figure sat huddled, thin and frail inside an old worn coat. Hearing their footsteps, the old man slowly turned, and Della froze. It was him, Marlowe. But he was far thinner than she remembered, his cheekbones sunken, his skin gone gray, and the kind eyes she had known were now hollowed by illness and exhaustion. The moment he saw her, his face brightened with an unspeakable relief, then immediately sank into worry when his gaze moved past her to Soren standing behind her. He rose shakily, one hand gripping the back of the pew. "Della," he whispered, his voice rough and hoarse. "You shouldn't have come here. You've put yourself in danger." She hurried toward him, supporting his frail arm, tears filling her eyes. "Mr. Marlowe, I've been looking everywhere for you these past few days. I thought I'd lost you. Are you all right?" The old man shook his head faintly and gave her a tired, sorrowful smile. "I'm fine, better than many others. I was given 20 more years than I should have had. That is more than enough." The elderly priest quietly stepped away, giving them privacy. Marlowe sat down again, gestured for Della to sit beside him, and began to tell, in a voice broken by coughing, the story he had kept hidden for 2 decades. "Long ago, I was not a dishwasher," he said. "I was an auditor, a meticulous man who spent his whole life working with numbers, and it was because of those numbers that I met your father." He looked at Della, his gaze softening. "Eamon Hartley was braver than anyone I ever knew. He discovered dirty money hidden behind charitable funds, but he needed someone who could confirm that the numbers were real, that it was not a mistake but a deliberate crime. I was that person. I reviewed every document, every transaction, and I confirmed it all. Your father and I, we were preparing to bring everything into the light together." His voice caught. "But before we could do it, someone betrayed us. Your father was forced to disappear to stay alive, and I chose to erase myself from life, to live like a shadow, a nameless old man no one noticed, so I could survive in peace. For 20 years, I hid inside my own ordinariness. He reached for Della's hand, his own cold and trembling, until I learned I did not have much time left. I could not die and leave that evil still honored in this world. So I began stirring everything up again, and I came to the diner where you worked, not by chance, but because I knew you were Eamon's daughter. I wanted to be near you, to watch over you quietly, because I had promised myself I would protect the last thing your father left in this world. With that, the old man slipped a trembling hand inside his coat, searching for something near his breast pocket. When he drew it out, resting in his thin palm was a small brass key, tarnished with age, carefully tied with a silver ribbon worn thin by the years. He placed it in Della's hand, closed her fingers around it, and looked at her with shining eyes. Your father gave me this key to keep 22 years ago, he said softly. He told me it was to be given only to you, and only when you were ready to know the whole truth. Della looked down at the small key lying in her palm, feeling the weight of 22 years pressed into one cold little piece of metal. The silver ribbon had darkened with age, frayed along the edges, but the knot was still intact, as though her father's own trembling hands had tied it before giving it away. What does it open? She whispered. Marlowe gave a soft cough, then answered. Something your father hid, the last thing he left behind in this world, something that can bring the whole truth into the light. But before I tell you where it is, you need to understand one thing, Della. This key is the only one. There is no other copy. Your father did that on purpose. He knew that as long as the key remained in the hands of someone trustworthy, those people could know where it was hidden and still be unable to open it. That is why they have not been able to take it for themselves all these years. And that is also why he tightened his hold on her hand, his eyes full of remorse. They had to watch you. They believed you were the only person who could lead them to the key, or to the place it opens. Della shuddered. So for those 6 months, the photographs, the cold notes, all of it had not been because they meant to harm her right away, but because they were waiting, patiently stalking her, waiting for her to unknowingly lead the way. She was not the target, she was the map. Then we have to get there first, she said, her voice firm. The place this key opens, where is it? Marlowe was silent for a moment, his eyes gazing far away through the stained glass windows, as though reaching back into an old memory. Your father never wrote the address plainly on paper, he said. He was too wise for that. Instead, he left me a phrase, one he said you would understand, or that one day you would find a way to understand. He said what you seek lies where the rails meet the water. Della softly repeated the words, where the rails meet the water. She frowned, trying to search for meaning inside each word. Soren, who had been standing silently behind them and listening, stepped forward then, understanding brightening his eyes. The old eastern docks, he said. There is a row of abandoned warehouses right where the old freight rail line once ran straight to the riverfront, where the cargo trains used to stop so goods could be loaded onto ships. That is where the rails meet the water. I know the place. Della turned to look at him, and a chilling truth suddenly joined itself together in her mind. The address in the message at 2 o'clock in the morning, she said. The old dock district address that the unknown number sent me. It points there too. Soren nodded slowly, his face thoughtful. That means whoever sent that message also knows, or has guessed, where it is hidden. They are trying to lead you there, maybe to set a trap, to wait for you to open the door for them. Marlowe nodded weakly, worry carving deep lines into his face. So you must be careful. They have been waiting for this moment for 20 years. Della looked down at the old man, her heart swelling with endless compassion. This thin, sick man had sacrificed his whole life, living like a shadow, all to preserve a truth and protect a girl who was not his own blood. And the person who betrayed my father back then, she asked softly, do you know who it was? The one who told them my father was about to testify. Marlowe looked up at her, and in those tired eyes flickered something bitter and angry. That is what has tormented me all these years, he said. The traitor is never the person people suspect. He was someone your father trusted. A man standing in the light, respected by everyone while his hands were stained. I knew who he was, but I had no proof, and an accusation without proof against a man like that would only have gotten me killed. He tightened his hand around hers. But your father had proof. All of it is where this key opens. And there is one more thing, Della, the most important thing, the last thing your father left behind. He stopped, breathing hard, his eyes trembling. Something even I have never heard. Your father said it was meant for you alone, and only you. They left Marlowe at the chapel under the protection of the old priest, after Soren quietly placed several of his own men around the area to keep watch. Della embraced the old man once before leaving, feeling his thin, trembling body in her arms, and promised him she would come back. Then she stepped into the car, the key tied with the silver ribbon clenched in her palm like a fragile treasure. Through the drive back to the city, she said very little, only silently watched the fields fall away behind them, giving way to the gray concrete blocks of the dock district. The sun had risen high, but it was hidden behind a thick layer of cloud, staining the whole sky a bleak leaden color. The old docks appeared before them like a graveyard of time. Long rows of enormous warehouses stood motionless, their tin roofs rusted, their windows shattered, their walls mottled with moss and faded graffiti. The old rail line wound between the warehouses, its rusted tracks half buried in wild grass, leading straight toward the riverbank, where the murky gray water drifted beneath the heavy sky. This was where the rails met the water, just as her father had said. Soren stopped the car in a hidden corner, turned off the engine, and for a moment they both sat still, listening to the frightening silence that covered the place. Not a single person in sight, not a sound except the wind whistling through broken window frames and the water slapping heavily against the embankment. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Soren asked, turning to her, his voice low. "Once we step inside, there's no going back." Della tightened her grip on the key, feeling the silver ribbon rub against her palm. She thought of her father, of the 20 years he had lived in darkness to protect her, of frail Marlowe waiting behind them, of Sophie sleeping peacefully in her hospital room, knowing nothing of the fact that her sister now stood on the edge of the truth. "My whole life, I've been running from the shadow of a father I thought had abandoned me," she said softly, her gaze steady. "Now I know he never left me at all. I owe him this. I have to see it through to the end." Soren looked at her for a moment, then nodded, and there was a quiet respect in his eyes. They stepped out of the car. The air outside was cold and damp, carrying the sharp smell of mud and the rusty scent of decaying metal. They followed the old rail line, stepping over puddles and piles of scrap, moving toward the row of warehouses closest to the river. Soren went first, every step careful, his eyes constantly sweeping their surroundings, alert to every shadow, every hidden corner. Della stayed close behind him, her heart pounding with each step. They found it at the end of the row, a warehouse smaller than the others, set apart, with a heavy iron door eaten by rust. Above the door, faint beneath the dust of years, was a peeling painted number that marked it apart from the rest. Della stepped forward, her hand trembling as she brought the key toward the old lock. For one moment, she feared that after all these years, the lock would be so rusted it could not open, that this whole journey would end in hopelessness right at the threshold of truth. But when she slid the key in and turned it, after a dry, grinding creak, the lock sprang open. Della looked up at Soren, and he gave a slight nod. Together they pushed the heavy iron door. It shrieked in a long, piercing protest as it slid aside, revealing a thick black darkness within, heavy with the smell of rotting paper and the dust of 2 forgotten decades. Della's heart hammered. Somewhere inside that darkness was the last thing her father had left behind, the answer to every question that had tormented her all her life. She placed one foot over the threshold, but at that very instant, Soren's hand suddenly blocked her path, holding her back. His whole body went rigid like a drawn wire, his gaze fixed on a dark corner deep inside the warehouse. Della followed his eyes, and the blood in her body seemed to freeze. In that dense darkness, where she had thought there were only boxes and oblivion, something had just moved, one shadow. Then 2. They had been there all along. They had been waiting in silence in the dark, certain that sooner or later she would come and open this door for them. Soren pushed Della behind him with one decisive movement, placing the full breadth of his body between her and the 2 dark figures, slowly stepping out of the shadows. As the pale light from the open doorway fell across them, Della recognized the 2 men, and her heart clenched when she realized that one of them was the same man who had cornered her in the diner parking lot the night before. They did not hurry. They moved with the confidence of men who believed they had the upper hand. "The girl led us right to the place," the man in front said, a cold smile spreading across his lips. "All we had to do was wait here, hand over the key and whatever is inside this warehouse. And no one has to make this unpleasant." Della tightened her grip around the key and stepped back, but Soren remained still as a wall, and when he spoke, His voice was so low and cold that even Della shivered. "Do you know whose ground you're standing on?" The two men faltered. Perhaps in the darkness earlier they had not clearly seen who he was, but now as Soren Vale's face appeared in the light, as that name began to match the rumors any man working these docks would have heard, the confidence on their faces began to waver. The man in front cast a quick glance at his companion, his smile stiffening. "This has nothing to do with you, Mr. Vale," he said, his voice losing some of its arrogance. "We're only following orders. That girl is holding something that belongs to our employer." From this moment on, Soren said, each word clear as a nail driven into the air, "She is under my protection, and anything inside this warehouse belongs to her. Go back and tell your employer that if he wants it, he can come find me himself and take it. For now, you have two choices. Turn around and walk out of here right now, or explain to your employer why you were foolish enough to pick a fight with the Vale family." A silence stretched through the warehouse, tight as a drawn wire. Della could almost not breathe. She saw the two men exchange uncertain looks, saw calculation written plainly on their faces, as they weighed the orders of the man they served against the price of facing a power the whole city feared. But then the second man, the taller one, seemed to decide the reward was worth the risk, and he lunged toward the old table against the wall, where a metal box lay covered in dust. Everything happened in a blink. Soren moved after him, fast and decisive, cutting him off before he could reach the box. The two figures struggled in the cramped darkness, paper crates crashing down, their feet pounding against the concrete floor and sending echoes through the warehouse. The first man charged in too, and in that chaotic instant, Della understood that she could not simply stand there and watch. Her heart hammering like a drum, she slipped past the struggle, ran straight to the table, wrapped both hands around the cold metal box, and clutched it tightly to her chest. "Della, get to the door," Soren shouted, one hand still pinning the thrashing man. "Run, now." She did not hesitate. She rushed toward the iron door, stumbling over the scattered scrap. Behind her she heard Soren, heard footsteps chasing after them, heard the panicked rhythm of her own heart. She had just reached the threshold when Soren broke free as well, using all his strength to shove the last man headlong into a pile of crates, buying himself a few precious seconds. He grabbed Della's hand, and they ran together, across the rusted rail line, through the puddles, toward the car. They threw themselves inside. Soren started the engine, and the car screamed forward, leaving behind the ruined row of warehouses and the two men staggering after them in vain. Only when the dock district had vanished behind them, only when the car had joined the larger road, did Della dare to breathe. She sagged back into the seat, both arms still locked around the metal box, her whole body trembling from fear and exhaustion. "Are you all right?" Soren asked, one hand still on the steering wheel, his eyes flicking quickly toward her. She nodded, unable to speak, then looked down at the box in her lap. It was small, made of darkened metal, sealed with the very lock her key had opened. With trembling hands, Della lifted the lid. Inside, resting neatly among faded velvet, were two things: a small recording device, an old kind from 20 years ago, and beside it, a data storage drive, quietly holding a truth that had waited nearly 2 decades for its chance to speak. They returned to the high-floor apartment, where Teodora was waiting, with a face tight with worry. When Della set the metal box on the table and took out the old recording device, the whole room sank into a solemn silence, as though everyone there could feel that they were standing at the threshold of something sacred. Della's hands trembled as she picked up the device, her finger searching for the button worn smooth by time. She looked up at Soren, and he gave a slight nod, standing close beside her like a silent support. She drew in a deep breath, then pressed the button. There was a faint rasp of static, the sound of old magnetic tape turning, and then, through the dust of nearly 20 years, a voice rose in the room. The voice of a man. Warm, gentle, a little tired, but overflowing with love. Della went still. She had never truly remembered her father's voice. That memory had faded long ago in the mind of a 5-year-old child. But the instant those first sounds touched her ears, something deep inside her broke open, as if her heart recognized that voice before her mind had time to understand. "My beloved Della," the voice began, "if you are hearing these words, it means you have grown old enough, strong enough, and brave enough to find the truth. I am sorry. I am sorry that I could not be beside you. I am sorry for all the years you grew up without me, for every time you needed a father and I could not be there. Tears spilled from Della's eyes and rolled down her cheeks, and she pressed a hand over her mouth to hold back her sobs. "I know you grew up believing I abandoned you," the voice continued, trembling with emotion. "And I know how deeply that belief must have wounded you. I have lain awake through countless nights tormenting myself over it. But my darling girl, you must believe me in this, even if you believe nothing else. I never, not for a single second, stopped loving you. I left not because I want to. I left because it was the only way to keep you alive." Her father's voice caught for a moment, then steadied again. "I discovered something I was never meant to know. A great crime, hidden behind respectable faces. I could have chosen silence, turned away, and gone on living peacefully beside you and your mother. But if I had done that, I would no longer have been the father I wanted you to be proud of. I wanted you to grow up in a world where truth still meant something, where those who do evil have to pay for it, no matter how powerful they are. So I chose to stand up, and the price was that I had to disappear from your life, so those people could not use you against me." Della sank into the chair, clutching the recorder to her chest as though she were holding her father himself. For more than 20 years, she had carried a nameless wound in her heart, the belief that she had been a child not important enough to be kept. That wound had shaped who she became, making her always feel she was not worthy of being loved, not worthy of being chosen to stay. Yet now, through this voice reaching back from the past, that wound was being healed, piece by piece, word by word. Her father had never cast her aside. He had loved her with a love so great that he had accepted the name of an unfaithful man, accepted a life and death of loneliness, just so she could be safe. "I do not know whether I will still be alive to see you again," the voice continued, gentler now. "But if you are hearing this, I need you to do one final thing. Not for me, but for all the innocent people that evil stole from. You must bring the truth into the light. Every piece of evidence I needed, I left in the data drive with this tape." His voice suddenly dropped, becoming more grave and urgent than ever. "But listen carefully, Della. This matters more than anything. Our true enemy, the one who caused it all, is not the man everyone fears, not the one standing in the shadows whom everyone thinks is the criminal. No, the true enemy is 1,000 times more dangerous than that, because for all these years, he has stood in the light, loved and respected by this entire city." The voice on the tape stopped for a beat, as though even her father needed to draw breath before speaking the name that had haunted him for the rest of his life. The whole room held its breath. Della tightened her grip around the recorder, not daring to blink. "His name is Gareth Pruitt," her father's voice said, and every syllable was heavy. "Remember that name, Gareth Pruitt. The man this entire city calls a great philanthropist, the man who built hospitals and shelters, the man whose name is engraved on gold plaques and praised at every ceremony. He is the one who stood at the head of the entire embezzlement network. He is the one who hollowed out relief funds meant for the poor, turning the kindness of thousands of people into gold and silver flowing into his own pockets. And when I found out, he was the one who gave the order to hunt me down." Della sat frozen. That name, Gareth Pruitt, she had heard it countless times. She had seen his kindly face on fundraising posters pasted across the city. She had once walked past a shelter that bore his name, had heard people speak of him with gratitude. Even the hospital where Sophie was being treated had a wing built with donations from his charitable foundation. The whole city worshipped him as a living saint. And all that time, beneath that shining mask, was the man who had destroyed her family. And the man everyone fears, her father's voice continued, the man named Calder Boone. The lone shark everyone in the dock district knows to avoid. He is only the shadow, the screen. For all these years, every sin, every suspicion has been pushed toward Calder Boone, while Gareth Pruitt has stood comfortably in the light, clean and respectable. People fear Boone, but Pruitt is the one pulling the strings. Boone takes orders from him. Every road leads back to Pruitt, but no one dares believe it, because how could a man who does so much good possibly be a devil? Della lifted her eyes to Soren, tears still clinging to her lashes, but now there was something else in her gaze, outrage. "My debt," she whispered, her voice trembling. "When Sophie first got sick, I had no money for her treatment, so I had to borrow from a loan shark. Someone introduced me to Calder Boone's people. I thought I was only a small debtor who happened to get tangled in his network. But now I understand. It was not an accident. They had targeted me from the beginning, through that very debt, to get close to me, to watch me." Soren stood silent beside her, and a deep change was moving across his face. All through the night and the day that followed, he had acted because of a promise, the promise his father had left behind, a debt of mercy passed from one generation to the next. He had protected Della because it was what his father had sworn to do. But now, looking at this woman, the daughter of a brave man who had sacrificed everything for what was right, the woman who had shared food with a lonely old man when no one was watching, the woman who had wept for her father and then risen again with iron determination, he realized something. His wish to protect her was no longer because of a promise made by the dead. It had become his own choice. "Della," he said softly, and she looked up at him. "I want you to know something. At first I helped you because my father promised to protect your family. That was a debt, but now it is different. I will bring this man into the light. I will help you see this through to the end. Not because of any promise anymore, but because I choose to do it. Because you deserve that." Della looked at him, and in that moment, amid all the fear and pain, she felt something strangely warm, the feeling for the first time in so many years that she was not alone. But that moment dissolved when Soren's phone suddenly vibrated. He answered, listened, and Della saw his face darken second by second. When he put the phone down, his eyes had turned sharply alert. "It was my man at the docks," he said, his voice lowering. The two men reported back to their employer. "Pruitt knows. He knows the box is no longer in the warehouse. He knows the truth is in our hands." That news rang like an alarm bell, and Della understood that the race had now entered its final, life and death stretch. Pruitt knew the truth was in their hands, which meant he would do everything he could to seal it away before it had a chance to spread. "We don't have time," Soren said, his face once again sharpened by that cold clarity. "Once Pruitt knows he has been backed into a corner, he will use every resource he has to destroy the evidence and silence anyone connected to it. The only way to protect you, to protect Marlowe, and to protect the truth itself, is to bring it into the light so fast he has no time to react. Once the whole world knows, silencing you will no longer matter to him." Della nodded, and suddenly remembered what Soren had told her, that Marlowe had secretly contacted a journalist before he disappeared. "The journalist Mr. Marlowe sent the documents to," she said. "We have to go to her. Mr. Marlowe trusted her. She has already started following this story." Soren nodded, and within an hour, through his network, he had identified the journalist, a woman named Renata Cole, a veteran investigative reporter who had spent her whole career exposing powerful people hiding behind polished masks. They met her at a safe place Soren arranged, and when Della placed the recorder and the data drive on the table, she saw the journalist's eyes light with fierce intensity. "I have been chasing Gareth Pruitt for years," Renata said, her voice full of emotion as she moved through the documents on the drive, the financial ledgers, the disguised transactions, the evidence Eamon Hartley had gathered and hidden away at the cost of his own life. "I always knew something was wrong behind those charitable smiles of his, but I never had enough proof. Not until now. These," she lifted her eyes to Della, "these are what can bring his entire empire down." But they were not the only ones racing against time. Pruitt, with all his power and connections, had caught the scent of where they were preparing to reveal the truth. As Renata and a trusted editor made their way to deliver copies of the evidence to the federal investigator's office, Pruitt's men tried to intercept them, hoping to seize the documents and smother everything before it could begin. But they had underestimated Soren's preparation. He had anticipated that move. His people had been quietly escorting Renata from a distance, and when Pruitt's men appeared, they realized they had stepped into a disadvantage, surrounded by men they did not dare touch. Not a single blow had to be thrown. The overwhelming presence of the Vale family's power alone was enough to make them falter and retreat in panic. Pruitt's final attempt to stop them had failed. The evidence reached the investigators safely, and once it was inside an official file, once Renata had begun publishing her investigative series, there was no force, however great, that could keep the truth from exploding. The empire of lies Gareth Pruitt had spent 20 years building began to crack, not through violence, not through bloody revenge, but through the very thing he had feared and run from all along, the truth laid bare beneath daylight. All that night, Della barely slept. She sat beside the great glass window, watching the city sink into darkness, her heart tangled between a familiar fear and a fragile hope that was slowly growing stronger. Soren sat quietly not far away, and for the first time since she had met him, the tension in his shoulders had eased a little, as if he too was waiting with her. Then dawn came, painting the horizon in a pale ribbon of pink and slowly driving the night away. And when the first rays of sunlight touched the window, the television screen on the wall came softly to life with the morning news. A female anchor appeared, her face grave, and behind her was a familiar photograph, the falsely kind face the whole city had once worshipped. Then her voice rang out clear and firm, speaking aloud the name that had been hidden for 20 years. Gareth Pruitt, one of the city's most respected philanthropists, is this morning at the center of a shocking investigation involving embezzlement through multiple charitable foundations. There are truths that need 20 years and one rainy night to be brought into the light, but once they step out of the darkness, they have the power to change everything. The weeks that followed passed like a whirlwind. Gareth Pruitt's empire collapsed piece by piece. The gold plaques engraved with his name were taken down, and the praise that had once surrounded him turned into the outrage of an entire city that had been deceived. Justice, slow as it may have been, finally found the right address, and the money stolen from the hands of the poor began to be traced back to where it truly belonged. Marlowe Quinn, the old man who had once lived like a shadow, was finally allowed to spend the peaceful days he had left in proper care, no longer running, no longer carrying the lonely burden of the truth by himself. But for Della, the greatest miracle was not the fall of the wicked man, but the thing waiting for her in a much simpler place. The debt that had once weighed on her shoulders was wiped clean, and Sophie's hospital bills, the burden that had kept Della awake through so many nights, were now fully taken care of. One early spring morning, when golden sunlight lay gently over the streets just beginning to warm, Della walked into the familiar hospital room, but this time not with a face worn out after a night shift, but with a smile. Sophie was sitting up in bed, her cheeks rosy again, her hair neatly braided, and when she saw her sister, her whole face lit up. "Della," she cried, opening her arms. Della ran to her, gathered her into her arms, buried her face in Sophie's hair, which smelled faintly of sunshine, and for the first time in a very long while she cried, not from fear or pain, but from happiness. The doctors said Sophie was recovering very well, that before long she would be able to go home, run and play again, go back to school, and live the full childhood Della had always longed to give her. Then one afternoon, Della returned to the place where everything had begun, the small diner beside the highway. But now, it was different. There was no cold curtain of night rain, no neon sign flickering as if it were about to die, no fear waiting in the dark. Instead, morning sunlight poured through the glass windows, brightening the whole room, and warm laughter rose from the familiar customers. She stood on the threshold, looking back at the parking lot where she had recklessly grabbed a stranger's sleeve and called him family, and she smiled softly at the strange workings of fate. It was here, in the most desperate moment of her life, that her path had turned in an entirely different direction. A familiar car pulled up outside, and Soren stepped out, still carrying that same calm presence, but the gray eyes that had once seemed so cold had softened greatly whenever they looked at her. He walked to her side, and together they looked out over the sunlit parking lot. "You know," Della said softly, "all my life, I thought being strong meant carrying everything by myself, facing everything alone. I got used to not relying on anyone." Soren turned to look at her. And now, she lifted her face, her eyes shining in the sunlight. "Now I understand that true strength is knowing when to place your trust in someone. It is daring to let another person step into your life." Soren was silent for a moment, then reached out and gently took her hand, his palm warm and steady, just as it had been on that first night. "Then remember this," he said, his voice low and warm. "From now on, you don't have to face tomorrow alone." Della looked at him, then looked out at the sunlight spreading gold across the road ahead. And in that moment, she realized that what she had found after all the danger and tears was more precious than even the truth about her father, more precious than justice for the past. She had found a place to belong, a hand to hold, a home, and the greatest wonder of all was that her own small, quiet kindness, the meals she had saved for a lonely old man without expecting anything in return, had turned out to be the very thing that saved her life.